It doesn't look like much from a distance. A long tube, awkward in the hands. The kind of weapon soldiers joked about when no officers were around. But if you were standing on a frozen ridgeline in the winter of 1950, boots stiff with cold and tanks grinding closer, with the slow confidence of steel beasts, you wouldn't laugh. You would feel the weight of that tube settle differently in your arms. You would smell metal warmed by your breath, and you would notice how every man nearby shifts slightly, waiting to see what you do. The M20 Super Bazooka never cared about elegance. It cared about survival. It cared about flipping the balance between infantry and armor in a single blast. And as you'll soon witness, it did exactly that. Ugly, bulky, but powerful enough to redraw the rules of close-range warfare, the final months of the Great War left a long list of lessons. And one of the clearest involved the uneasy balance between infantry and armored vehicles. Soldiers in the field learned that a tank did not need perfect armor to inspire fear. The simple act of rolling forward, its engine rumbling like a giant animal waking from sleep, could force entire units to scatter. Weapons meant to stop such machines often struggled with range, penetration, or reliability. The original bazooka, light and handy, had been useful against thin armor early in the conflict. But by the end of the war, it was barely enough. Crews saw their rockets bounce off improved plates, leaving only scorch marks. This mismatch created a quiet pressure that followed planners long after the fighting ended. When the war stopped, the need for a better solution did not fade. Engineers studied damaged tanks, broken launchers, and scattered reports from the field. They worked in workshops filled with drawings, smoke from welding torches, and the dry smell of metal shavings. The goal was simple: build a weapon that gave infantry a real answer to the growing strength of post-war armor. The design team soon realized that a more powerful rocket demanded a longer launch tube, stronger electrical components, and a sturdier frame. In the end, the new launcher stretched far beyond what many soldiers expected, forming a long, awkward tube with joints, clamps, and wiring that looked almost unfinished. The weapon received the name M20. Though that number alone could not hide how strange it looked. Troops who saw early prototypes wondered how anyone was supposed to move quickly with something that resembled a metal pipe taken from a factory floor. The launcher felt heavy in the hands, and its length made it difficult to turn in tight spaces. Some joked that the thing would knock a man off balance before it ever knocked out a tank. Even test crews treated it with mixed curiosity and caution, unsure whether the extra size justified whatever power hid inside that hollow tube. Despite the jokes, the M20 had a quiet confidence built into its design. The longer tube allowed the rocket to accelerate more smoothly, reducing wobble and improving accuracy. Engineers shaped the warhead to punch through much thicker armor than the earlier bazooka could ever manage. A new ignition system promised more reliable firing, though it relied on batteries that did not always cooperate in cold weather. These details mattered far more than appearances. But appearance was the first thing anyone saw, and in the world of military equipment, first impressions often stayed longer than facts. Testing grounds became the stage for early demonstrations. Crews stepped into open fields, marked with burnt craters, shattered frames, and scattered metal plates used as targets. Sunlight glinted on rails and wires as engineers briefed the soldiers on how to load, aim, and fire the unfamiliar launcher. A shockwave pushed dust into the air, and the impact tore a jagged hole through a thick armor plate, placed at a distance the old bazooka could never reach. Observers felt the result more than they heard it, the kind of result that speaks through the motion of bodies shifting, glances shared, and the steadying of breath. Yet even with proof of performance, many questions remained. The launcher needed a two-man team to operate smoothly. One carried the heavy tube, while the other handled rockets packed in sturdy containers. Movement required coordination, and setting up a firing position demanded space and patience. In the fluid environment of infantry combat, such demands could mean the difference between success and disaster. Commanders debated how to integrate the weapon into their units. Should it belong to small squads for close defense, or should it be placed in specialized teams trained for anti-armor roles? Opinions varied, and the weapon waited in storage rooms and supply depots while leaders searched for answers. Crates filled with launchers and training manuals left assembly lines that smelled of paint, metal, and machine oil. Instructors opened those crates on firing ranges across the Pacific and the American mainland, teaching new soldiers how to handle the launcher. Young recruits approached it with a mix of excitement and hesitation. They practiced assembling the two halves, connecting wires, checking the battery, and loading a rocket. Sweat mixed with dust as crews learned how the long tube balanced on their shoulders, how it kicked back slightly on firing, and how the exhaust flare forced everyone to remain aware of what stood behind them. As training expanded, instructors highlighted a truth that would shape every future battle involving the M20. Power meant responsibility. A misfire could expose a team, a misplaced shot could reveal their position, and the exhaust could endanger anyone standing too close. The weapon demanded care, teamwork, and quick decision-making under pressure. These requirements gave the M20 a personality of its own, something far different from the older bazooka. It was no longer a simple shoulder tool. It was a focused instrument meant to change the rhythm of infantry engagements. Reports from intelligence analysts added another layer of urgency. Rumors spread of new tanks rolling out from foreign factories, machines with thicker armor and improved guns. If conflict broke out again, infantry would face armored threats far beyond anything encountered in the previous war. The M20, strange and bulky as it appeared, seemed like the only tool capable of narrowing the gap. This quiet understanding settled over training fields and command tents alike. The future would require more than courage. It would require something that could punch through steel. By the time the first crates of M20 launchers waited on docks, bound for overseas deployment, the last traces of doubt had not disappeared, but they no longer controlled the conversation. Soldiers understood that ugly equipment had served them well before. Many remembered how early armored vehicles or crude flamethrowers had also faced skepticism, only to prove their worth in combat. The M20 fit into that tradition. It might not please the eye, and it might not handle like a small, neat rifle, but it promised the one thing infantry always needed when armor approached: a way to fight back with real force. As the world edged toward another conflict on distant mountains, the M20 waited in its crates, wrapped in grease paper and faint chemical smell. It waited for the moment when its strange shape, long ridges, and heavy frame would no longer be judged by looks alone. It waited for the first battlefield to reveal what power truly meant for those who had to carry it. Transport ships cut through cold waters as the conflict on the Korean peninsula grew wider and more chaotic. Inside the dim cargo holds, crates marked with stenciled letters held the first batches of the long, awkward M20 launchers. Soldiers gathered around them during quiet moments, lifting lids, checking components, and feeling the strange balance of the tube. Few imagined that the coming months would test every inch of metal and wiring inside those crates. The early phase of the war moved so quickly that equipment barely reached units before they found themselves marching toward enemy lines. Following narrow mountain roads, mud-slick trails, and broken bridges left behind by retreating forces. The Korean landscape offered few places of comfort. The steep ridges rose like jagged walls, and mist clung to slopes in slow-moving sheets. Fields turned into swamps after rain, and streams cut harsh lines through valleys. Infantry units moving through these paths carried their gear on aching shoulders. The M20 launcher, heavier and longer than anything most soldiers trained with before, shifted awkwardly with every step. Its length made it difficult to navigate under low branches or across rocky ledges. Still, crews adjusted, learning to tilt the tube slightly, adjust their pace, and rely on partners to keep balance on narrow ground. Many units had never faced Soviet-built T-34 tanks in combat, and the stories painted them as relentless creatures. Crews spoke of sloped armor that deflected smaller rockets, engines that pushed the tanks steadily up hills, and machine guns that swept valleys with steady bursts. When scouts returned with reports of turret silhouettes moving behind distant tree lines, tension settled over the infantry columns. Every man began to check his ammunition, his field gear, and the location of the closest M20 team. The old bazooka would have been almost useless against such machines, and everyone knew it. Winter arrived early in the mountains. The cold did not simply surround the soldiers. It crept into boots, stiffened gloves, and slowed fingers that needed to assemble the M20's electrical connections. Batteries weakened in low temperatures, and ignition wires felt brittle under freezing air. Crews quickly learned to warm the battery packs inside jackets for several minutes before preparing to fire. This small ritual became part of daily routine, repeated again and again whenever the temperature fell. Hands held the warm battery like a fragile object, knowing that a single failure could leave them defenseless at the worst possible moment. The first skirmishes in the hills forced rushed firing tests under real enemy pressure. Infantry companies setting up hasty defensive lines often worked with little warning. They dug shallow foxholes, stacked sandbags, and tried to read the distant engine sounds echoing through valleys. When the rumble grew louder, the M20 crews moved to the front, crawling into firing positions between broken tree stumps and shattered walls. One soldier carried the long tube, its cold metal pressing against the side of his neck, while the assistant gunner loaded a rocket from its cylindrical container and connected the firing wires. The first launch in Korea came without ceremony. A tank emerged from the fog, its headlamp shrouded with mud, its tracks grinding against icy soil. Infantry scattered behind cover, while the M20 crew steadied the tube on a pair of shaky arms, pushing snowflakes sideways as the assistant gunner shouted measurements over the sound of the approaching engine. The trigger pressed down, and the rocket burst from the tube with a violent flash that lit the fog like a brief sunrise. The explosion struck the tank's turret, chipping away metal and sending smoke curling upward. The hit did not destroy the vehicle, but it forced the tank to withdraw behind a ridge, buying precious time for the infantry to reposition. The weapon worked, but not as decisively as many hoped. Soldiers saw the tank disappear instead of erupt in flames, leaving a trace of doubt behind. Some wondered if they had fired too far or if the angle had been wrong. Others questioned whether the weapon's power matched the promises made by the manuals. The uncertainty created a new layer of tension, especially when enemy armor could return at any moment. But even a forced retreat from the tank meant the weapon disrupted its advance, and that small success became something to hold on to during the harsh hours that followed. Logistics teams faced their own challenges. Rockets had to be carried in protective containers to prevent moisture from damaging the propellant. Moving them across icy ridges required rope harnesses and steady coordination between porters. The heavy rounds were passed along lines of soldiers during long marches, each man taking his turn before handing the load to the next. In the cold air, crates creaked, straps dug into shoulders, and breath rose in pale clouds. The weapon consumed energy before it ever fired a shot, yet units accepted the burden because they knew the alternative. As battles continued through the mountain passes, the sound of tank engines carried far at night. Patrols often stopped moving just to listen, trying to guess direction and distance. The M20 teams slept lightly during these hours, their launcher resting on crates beside them, the battery pack tucked inside someone's jacket to keep it warm through the night. Training transformed into habit as crews rehearsed loading motions in the dark, checking connectors by touch and whispering reminders about backblast safety. The landscape offered no comfort during these nights, only cold wind and the knowledge that steel machines could appear at any moment. By late winter, more units reached the front, each receiving quick lessons on the M20. Some crews fired only a few practice rockets before being sent into combat. Their first real shot came while crouched behind a stone terrace or a collapsed hut, watching a tank crawl through distant haze. These improvised moments shaped the weapon's early reputation. Soldiers began to speak with cautious respect when describing the launcher. It still looked strange and still felt heavy, but it delivered something they desperately needed. A real chance to stop armor on unforgiving terrain. As the front line shifted back and forth through the mountains, the M20 grew into a silent presence across the battlefield. Its long frame, slung over shoulders, moved with each retreat and counterattack. Snow gathered in the ridges of its metal panels, and thin layers of ice covered the wiring until crews brushed it off with gloved hands. Each time the launcher was pulled into position, it carried the weight of expectation that went far beyond its physical bulk. It symbolized the possibility of pushing back against machines that once seemed unstoppable. These early months became the foundation for everything the weapon would later accomplish. The Korean mountains tested not only its power, but the men who carried it. The rough terrain, the cold air, the sudden appearances of enemy tanks, and the endless need for teamwork shaped a new understanding of what the M20 could do. The launcher had left the factory floor, crossed oceans, and entered a landscape far harsher than any training range. Now it waited for the moment when infantry would stand their ground again, and the weapon's true potential would reveal itself with far greater clarity. Snow fell in soft, slow-moving flakes across the ridgeline, covering trenches and broken stones in a pale layer that blurred shapes and muffled sound. Infantry units crouched behind makeshift cover, waiting for movement in the valley below. The sky carried a faint smell of fuel drifting from distant engines, a smell that always brought a quiet shift among the men. Whenever that scent reached their lines, it signaled only one thing. Tanks were coming. Soldiers tightened their gloves, adjusted helmet straps, and looked toward the M20 team, positioned behind a small mound of frozen earth. The crew had practiced this moment over and over. But practice never removed the tension that settled over a battlefield just before steel appeared through the fog. The valley slowly revealed motion, first a shape, then a silhouette, then the unmistakable slope of a T-34 seconds turret pushing through drifting snow. The tank moved calmly, with the confidence of a machine designed to keep rolling under fire. Its engine growl bounced between hills, creating vibrations in the ground that crawled into the trenches. Infantry instinctively lowered themselves behind cover, while the M20 team lifted their long launcher into position. The tube felt heavier than usual, partly from cold metal and partly from the weight of responsibility growing with every passing second. A rocket sat ready in its container, already connected to the wiring, and the assistant gunner pressed his hands around the battery pack held close to his chest for warmth. As more tanks emerged behind the first, the ridge took on a tense stillness. Snow settled on shoulders, helmets, and the ridges of the launcher. The crew exchanged a few quiet gestures, planning angle and distance. They waited for the right moment, because the M20 demanded patience. A rushed shot could strike only the tank's front armor, wasting the round. A delayed shot could mean the tank climbed close enough for its machine gun to rake the entire hillside. Somewhere between those two dangers, the correct timing waited small, fragile, and unforgiving. The gunner tucked the launcher tightly against his shoulder, leaning slightly to maintain stability on the icy ground. The cold numbed the edges of his fingers and made the trigger feel like a stiff wire instead of a simple switch. He breathed slowly, aware that any fog from his breath could reveal his exact position if the light shifted. Down in the valley, the lead tank turned slightly, presenting a wider angle. The gunner steadied the sights and let the moment build. The shot broke the quiet with a burst of light that cut through the fog. The rocket streaked forward, leaving a long flame trail that illuminated the snow for a brief instant. The sound was sharp and violent, echoing across the ridgeline and down through the valley. Infantry pressed against the ground as the rocket slammed into the tank's side with a heavy metallic crack. The explosion pushed a shockwave outward, kicking snow upward in a wide arc. Smoke and dust mixed together, forming a dark cloud around the hull. For a few seconds, nothing moved. The tank sat in place, its tracks grinding weakly before stopping entirely. A glow flickered inside the hull through the torn armor plate. Then a sudden burst of flame escaped from a crack near the turret ring, rising into the falling snow. The crew inside had no chance to escape. The machine that once looked unstoppable now sat frozen in the valley, burning slowly against the white landscape. The ridge reacted with a wave of relieved movement. The infantry, who had been pinned behind rocks and trenches, lifted their heads slightly, watching the burning hull as if confirming the result again and again. The M20 crew lowered the launcher with shaky hands, their breath heavy and warm inside freezing air. For many soldiers watching, it was the first time they had seen a tank destroyed by an American infantry weapon in Korea. This moment carried more than tactical value, it carried reassurance. Something finally existed that could stand between infantry and armored steel. The second tank in the formation halted, turning its turret toward the ridgeline, searching for the source of the strike. Snow swirled around its barrel as it swept arcs across the hillside. The M20 team dropped behind their cover, listening to the rumble of the machine repositioning. The assistant gunner scrambled to prepare another rocket, fingers stiff from cold and adrenaline. Loading under pressure felt different than loading during practice. Small steps connecting wires, checking contact points. Pressing the battery felt slower, heavier, and far more delicate. The second tank fired a machine gun burst into the ridge, sending dirt and snow flying into the air. Tracers cut red lines across the fog, and infantry pressed their bodies deeper into the ground. The M20 crew crawled sideways to avoid being pinned, carrying the launcher between them. The long tube scraped against rocks and snagged on branches, slowing every movement. They needed a new angle, because the tank now watched their previous position closely. Finding that angle demanded both courage and calm coordination. By the time the launcher was set again, the second tank had advanced a few meters, pushing past its burning companion. The heat from the wreck reflected off its hull, forming wavering distortions in the cold air. The assistant gunner whispered the distance, his voice low and steady. When he pressed the trigger again, the ignition lit with a sharp crack, and another rocket roared through the valley. This time the explosion hit near the tracks, shredding the wheels and locking the machine in place. The tank jerked forward once more, then halted completely. The battle shifted instantly. Without the tanks pushing forward, enemy infantry lost momentum and took cover behind rocks and trees. US troops advanced several meters to hold the line, encouraged by the change. The M20 team felt exhaustion rising through their muscles, but also relief. The launcher had done what it was created to do, and now every soldier on that ridge saw it differently. The weapon no longer looked like a strange metal pipe. It looked like survival. After the battle ended, crews gathered around the damaged tanks, studying the holes punched through armor. The edges were jagged and sharp, burned black from the explosion. Engineers photographed the impact points, marking angles and distances. Soldiers touched the cold metal, feeling the thickness of the destroyed plates. Each observation added to their understanding, shaping future tactics and firing techniques. The weapon's power was no longer theoretical. It was real, visible, and proven. As night fell, the crew stored the launcher carefully, wrapping it in canvas to protect it from frost. They understood that this would not be the last time they were called to stop armor. The valley where the first tank burned became a turning point, not only for their unit, but for the growing reputation of the M20 across the peninsula. It marked the moment when doubt began to fade and trust began to take root. The weapon had spoken in fire, noise, and torn steel, and its message had changed the battlefield. The destruction of the two tanks on the snowy ridge spread through nearby units faster than any official report. Soldiers talked about it while warming their hands near small stoves, while cleaning rifles, and even while trying to rest in shallow bunkers carved into frozen hillsides. The moment felt like a shift in the war, a sign that infantry no longer had to fear the heavy tread of armor without a fighting chance. Commanders noticed this change as well. Confidence altered behavior, and behavior began shaping strategy. It became the center of a growing effort to reshape how infantry defended, advanced, and survived. Frontline officers gathered in makeshift command posts, studying maps dotted with grease pencil marks. They discussed firing arcs, ambush corridors, and the best ways to position the new launcher. Instead of reacting to tanks, they started planning to channel them. Terrain took on new meaning. A narrow mountain pass became an ideal trap. A stone terrace became a firing platform. Even ruined farmhouses turned into temporary strongpoints, where a two-man team could wait with a clear line of sight. The awkward length of the launcher mattered less when placed in locations where tanks were forced to expose their flanks. The idea was simple: force the enemy to move exactly where the M20 wanted them to move. Training routines changed across battalions. Before Korea, anti-tank drills involved light launchers that could be carried and fired quickly. Now, squads practiced slow and deliberate motions, tailored to the M20's size and weight. Teams rehearsed loading and aiming from kneeling, standing, and prone positions. They practiced switching roles in case one man was wounded. The cold taught them to handle the battery with care, to warm it before every engagement, and to check wires by feel when visibility vanished in fog or snow. Every motion grew sharper and more automatic, shaped by repetition and the quiet pressure of knowing that tanks rarely gave second chances. These adjustments created a new rhythm in infantry formations. Instead of moving in one broad line, squads broke into smaller elements that stretched across terrain in staggered patterns. This allowed multiple firing angles on the same target. Flanking units coordinated their timing so that a tank pushing forward would always risk exposing its side to at least one M20 team. These overlapping fields of fire turned hillsides into invisible webs designed to slow or halt armored advances. When tanks tried pushing through, their routes narrowed into predictable paths, and the M20 waited for them. After losing tanks in several engagements, they approached hills with more caution. Smoke grenades burst ahead of their path, creating drifting grey walls meant to hide their movement. Infantry advanced beside the tanks more tightly than before, hoping to shield the machines from ambushes. Mortar teams targeted ridgelines, where M20 teams were likely to hide. This back and forth created a new battlefield rhythm, each side trying not only to fire first, but to shape the environment itself. The M20 crews adapted in return. They selected firing positions that made smoke screens less effective, such as high ground, where wind currents carried the smoke downward. When enemy infantry tried to advance alongside tanks, riflemen and machine gunners coordinated suppressive fire to keep them pinned long enough for the M20 to fire. Communication became the unseen backbone of every successful ambush. Quiet hand signals, short radio updates, and even taps on the shoulder guided movements through the chaos. The long launcher rested across rocks or broken sandbags as crews tracked tanks through smoke and shifting light, waiting for one clear angle. Each round was heavy and packed in thick containers, and the rugged terrain slowed transport mules, trucks, and porters. Soldiers carried extra rockets in small bundles tied to their belts or strapped to packs, sharing the weight across the squad. Even with these efforts, many M20 teams entered battle with only a few rockets available. This limitation shaped their tactics. They waited for the most decisive moment, refusing to waste a rocket on a poor angle or a half-hidden silhouette. As days turned into weeks, captured enemy soldiers confirmed what frontline troops already sensed. Tank crews avoided narrow mountain passes they once used confidently. They changed routes to avoid areas where the launcher had previously appeared. In some sectors, tanks advanced only at night, believing the darkness might reduce the weapon's accuracy. These adjustments revealed the growing influence of the M20, showing that even without firing, its presence weighed heavily on enemy planning. Commanders responded by integrating the launcher even deeper into offensive strategies. When units prepared to advance, IM-20 teams often moved at the edges of the formation, ready to counter any armored counterattack. During nighttime raids, the long tube appeared as a silhouette against moonlit slopes, carried cautiously through shadows. In defensive lines, crews dug special firing pits angled toward likely tank approaches, shaping the terrain to match the weapon's strengths. Over time, the M20 no longer felt like a specialized tool. It became part of the natural flow of infantry combat, as essential as machine guns or mortars. The launcher's influence extended beyond tactics. Soldiers began modifying, carrying straps, padding shoulder areas, and using cloth wraps to quiet metal parts. Some tied extra insulation near the battery connectors to protect them from freezing winds. These small adjustments, done silently in trenches or tents, reflected how deeply the weapon had entered daily life for frontline troops. Every improvement, even the smallest one, increased the odds of survival. Reports from the field reached higher command soon after. Analysts noted the increasing number of tanks disabled or destroyed by infantry teams equipped with the launcher. They compared these results with previous wars, recognizing a clear shift. The balance between armor and infantry was no longer one-sided. A single two-man crew could alter the outcome of an entire engagement. The battlefield had transformed from a place where tanks pushed infantry into retreat to one where infantry could fight armor on more equal terms, given the right preparation. By early spring, units across the peninsula embraced this new reality. Soldiers took positions in trenches, reinforced with frozen sandbags, their M20 launchers resting close by. They watched valleys and slopes with a new confidence, knowing that even the largest machine rolling toward them had a weakness waiting to be exposed with skill and timing. Tanks were still deadly, and mistakes still cost lives. But the battlefield felt different now. The infantry no longer felt outmatched. They had a tool that could tip the balance, and they had learned how to use it with precision and teamwork. As the mountains thawed and mist returned to the valleys, the stage was set for even larger battles. The M20, once doubted for its shape and size, had begun rewriting infantry doctrine piece by piece. But the hardest tests still waited ahead, where entire units would rely on the launcher to survive encirclement and break through overwhelming assaults. The lessons learned during these months would soon be put to the ultimate test, shaping the outcome of battles that would decide the fate of the front itself. The encirclement formed slowly at first, like a tightening ring hidden beneath drifting snow. Units at Chipyong-ni noticed small signs before the full danger became clear. Scouts returned with reports of enemy movement along distant ridges. Runners arrived breathless, describing columns of troops shifting through forests under the cover of early dusk. The ground trembled at night from unseen marches, and the faint glow of campfires flickered behind tree lines. Soon the hills around the isolated outpost pulsed with enemy activity. The defenders understood they were no longer dealing with scattered attacks. Something larger, heavier, and far more coordinated pressed toward them. Inside hastily built defensive lines, soldiers prepared for a long fight. Frozen earth hardened the trenches, forcing men to carve deeper positions with numb hands and dull tools. Machine guns found firing arcs, mortars were placed behind reinforced berms, and communication wires snaked through snow like thin lifelines. Among all these preparations, the M20 teams received special attention. Commanders knew tanks would be part of the assault. The enemy wanted a breakthrough, and armored vehicles were often the hammer used to smash defensive rings. The M20 launcher, awkward but powerful, would become the hinge on which their survival rested. Nights at Chipyong-ni carried a heavy stillness, broken only by gusts of wind sliding down the slopes. The cold sharpened every sound. Boots crunching snow, rifles clinking against helmets, and hushed whispers carried farther than anyone wished. M20 crews huddled near their launchers, sharing warmth around the precious batteries tucked under jackets. They checked wires again and again, making sure the cold had not stiffened them beyond use. Rockets lay in small piles behind sandbags, their containers frosted at the edges. Everything had to work on the first try. There would be no time to troubleshoot under fire. The assault began before dawn. Enemy artillery opened the attack with harsh, repeated blasts that shook the earth and sent shivers through frozen trenches. Shells burst across the perimeter, throwing dirt, snow, and wood into the air. The bombardment rolled in waves, lifting and descending like a heavy tide that left men blinking through dust clouds and ringing ears. Shadows moved in wide lines, advancing steadily despite the fire. Machine guns answered with bright flashes, and mortars dropped rounds that sent echoes bouncing between ridges. Then came the sound everyone had been waiting for, the metallic grind of engines moving through the storm of artillery smoke. Tanks emerged through drifting dust, their steel bodies glistening with frost and mud. Their silhouettes rose behind infantry waves, forming dark, advancing shapes that tore through the fog like armored beasts. The defenders braced themselves. The true test of everything learned in the mountains was about to begin. M20 teams crawled into position, while explosions continued around them. Snow fell from branches shaken by shockwaves, and dirt rolled down the sides of trenches. The gunner placed the launcher across a sandbag wall, adjusting angle and height with careful precision. The assistant gunner moved behind him, connecting wires with stiff fingers, warming the battery against his chest one last time. The smell of burning powder mixed with freezing air as the crew steadied themselves. Even with fear rising in their throats, their movements remained practiced and calm. The first tank pushed forward through a gap where the defensive line dipped into a shallow ravine. Infantry surrounding it fired upward at the ridgeline, trying to suppress any M20 team hidden there. The gunner waited until the tank turned slightly to climb over a broken fence post. The angled movement revealed its side plate, even if only for a second. That second was enough. The rocket fired with a burst of flame, sending backblast snow swirling behind the crew. The projectile struck the tank's flank, igniting a violent explosion that threw shards of armor into the air. Flames rose immediately, and the tank lurched before collapsing onto its side. The explosion changed the rhythm of the attack. The enemy infantry slowed their advance, shielding their heads from debris. The tanks behind the first adjusted formation, unsure of where the next shot might come from. M20 crews repeated the process, shifting positions after each shot to avoid being targeted. They moved through trenches slick with freezing mud, lifting the heavy launcher over logs and shattered beams, whispering quick directions over the roar of gunfire. The battlefield felt alive with motion, sound, and flashing light. The M20 team waiting there barely had time to settle into position. The assistant gunner slid a rocket into place, while the tank's engine growled louder, pressing closer. The launch came at near point-blank range. The explosion forced both crew members into the snow as a wave of heat flashed across their faces. When they looked up again, the tank sat still, smoke rising from the hole where the warhead had struck. Ammunition dwindled. Many M20 crews were down to their last 1 or 2 rockets. The defenders had to choose targets carefully. Wasting a shot on a poor angle meant losing the ability to stop the next vehicle pushing toward the perimeter. Every decision carried weight. The frozen wind stung their faces, but adrenaline kept them alert as tanks probed for weak points. Near midday, a fresh armored push surged against the eastern sector, where trenches ran along a narrow ridge. Only one M20 crew remained capable of firing there. The team crawled into a shallow depression created by earlier artillery blasts. Snow filled the edges of the crater, forming small ridges that helped hide the launcher. The gunner steadied himself and watched as another tank advanced through drifting smoke. The assistant gunner passed the last rocket with both hands, his breath shaking from exhaustion and cold. A moment passed before a burst of flame erupted from inside, scattering debris across the ridge. Infantry nearby cheered despite the ongoing battle. The ridge held, and the tank advance stalled. With armor halted, the enemy's infantry no longer had the force needed to break through. Slowly, the assault weakened, turning from a massive push into scattered fights across small pockets of the perimeter. Fires from destroyed vehicles burned steadily, casting orange light across snow-covered ground. Soldiers moved cautiously through trenches, checking on wounded, distributing ammunition, and preparing for any renewed attack. The M20 teams sat quietly beside their empty rocket containers, their hands trembling not from fear, but from the exhaustion of a long, unforgiving battle. They had stopped armored thrust after armored thrust, often with only seconds to spare. Their efforts had saved the defensive ring from collapse. The battle at Chipyongni was far from over. but the hardest blows had been absorbed. Its power had turned desperate moments into narrow victories. The storm had broken against the perimeter, and the defenders still stood. Morning arrived at Chipyong-ni with a thin haze rolling across the snowfields, and for the first time in many hours, the hills felt still. Smoke curled gently from the wrecks scattered along the slopes, drifting like slow ribbons across the cold air. Soldiers walked carefully among the burned-out hulls, stepping around twisted metal and melted rubber. Their uniforms were covered in dust, soot, and frost, and their faces carried the tired calm that often followed battles fought at the edge of survival. In this quiet, the presence of the M20 felt different. The weapon rested on crates and sandbags, wrapped in cloth and leaning against trenches, no longer buzzing with the frantic energy of combat. Instead, it stood as a reminder of what had happened during the long defense, an unlikely tool that had changed the course of the fight. As the defenders gathered for briefings, commanders studied maps and casualty reports with careful attention. The encirclement had not broken them. They held the line, forced back repeated armored assaults, and survived a night that could have ended the entire outpost. Wherever the M20 had been placed correctly and fired with precision, the line held. Tank thrusts froze in place. Enemy infantry lost momentum. Openings that could have widened into collapses remained intact. The launcher had become a pivot around which entire sections of the battle had turned. Back at division headquarters, analysts began collecting reports from units across the front. Their goal was simple: measure the launcher's impact in a clear and organized way. They compared the number of tanks destroyed, the distances of engagements, and the conditions under which each shot was fired. Photographs of destroyed turrets, torn tracks, and cracked armor filled their tables. Each image carried the same unmistakable signature: a clean, burned hole left by the shaped charge warhead. These details confirmed what soldiers already understood on the ground. The M20 had done something the older launchers could not. It had shifted the balance between infantry and armor in some of the harshest terrain and weather conditions possible. As word spread through higher command, foreign observers took interest as well. Military advisors from allied nations visited forward bases, inspecting launchers, recording interviews, and watching demonstrations. They examined the rockets, wiring, and folding mechanisms, noting the simplicity of some components and the ruggedness of others. Although the weapon looked crude in many ways, just a long tube with clamps, wires, and a heavy battery, it delivered performance that armies around the world could not ignore. For many nations, the M20 represented a new concept: a single infantry team capable of stopping a tank without heavy artillery or specialized armored units nearby. This recognition shaped the future of anti-tank design. Engineers in multiple countries studied the principle behind the warhead rather than the launcher's shape. The shaped charge effect, combined with steady acceleration inside the long tube, offered a template that could be adapted into smaller, lighter, and more flexible weapons. The M20, with all its awkward size, acted like a stepping stone toward modern shoulder-fired anti-armor systems. In the years that followed, its influence appeared in weapons that looked nothing like it but behaved like its descendants. Rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless rifles, and early portable guided systems all carried some trace of the lessons that began on those frozen hills. For the men who carried the M20, its legacy was more personal. Many remembered the weight on their shoulders during long marches, the way the cold metal stuck to their gloves, and the narrow windows of opportunity when a tank exposed its flank. They remembered the heat of the backblast on their faces, the smell of burning propellant, the sound of rockets cutting through the air, and the moments of silence just before an explosion confirmed a hit. These memories formed a deep respect that grew from experience rather than design. They knew the weapon's flaws, its bulk, its sensitivity to batteries, and the difficulty of moving quickly with it under fire. But they also knew its strength, and that strength had carried them through desperate hours. After the battle, logistics teams collected damaged launchers and inspected them for cracks and misalignment. Some were repaired with new clamps and fresh wiring. Others were replaced entirely. Each launcher told a different story. One carried dents from shrapnel. Another had frost marks along its frame from being fired in extreme cold. These details became part of the weapon's history, a physical record of how infantry used it across mountains, ridges, and valleys. Even the rockets themselves left a legacy. Empty containers piled near trenches reminded soldiers of the moments when the fate of the line had depended on a single shot. In training camps far from the front, instructors taught new crews using updated manuals that incorporated lessons learned in Korea. They described firing positions chosen by frontline teams, emphasized the importance of battery care, and explained the need for clear communication before every launch. These lessons shaped future generations of soldiers, preparing them to use the weapon or whatever replaced it with the kind of discipline and understanding that came only from the experiences written in those frozen hills. As the war progressed and new equipment arrived, the battlefield continued to evolve. Tanks grew stronger, infantry tactics shifted, and technology advanced, yet the imprint of the M20 remained. It had proven that infantry could challenge armor directly, even in harsh terrain and under severe pressure. This changed the way planners viewed small units, giving them greater flexibility and responsibility. It also changed how enemy armor behaved. No tank crew could advance confidently once they learned how far the launcher's reach extended and how quickly a well-trained team could prepare a shot. By the time the fighting slowed and armistice talks began forming the outlines of a temporary peace, the M20 had already secured its place in military history. It did not carry the sleek appearance of modern weapons. The launcher existed to solve a problem, and it solved it with force, consistency, and a rugged simplicity that matched the battlefield itself. In the years that followed, museums displayed the M20 as a symbol of a transitional era. Visitors saw its long tube and wondered how such an ungainly object could have played such a decisive role. Veterans, however, saw it differently. They knew what that tube had meant on cold nights, when tanks moved unseen through fog and survival depended on one well-timed shot. To them, the launcher was not ugly. It was a lifeline. The story of the M20 ended not on a battlefield, but in the legacy it left behind. Its design became the root from which countless modern systems grew. Its performance reshaped infantry doctrine, and its presence gave soldiers something they rarely had when facing armored steel at close range: a sense that they could stand their ground and fight back with real power.